The problem is that we're facing a world in which critical limits are looming, and we have to somehow, as a collective, as a planetary collective, change our ways if we expect to have a world that looks in any way habitable for the human species, but also the other species that share the planet with us.
The types of changes that we need to society, to our infrastructures, to our cultures, to our technologies are really deep. They're far deeper than we often pretend. And so the word transformation is just really getting at that point that we're really after very deep kinds of change here.
The spaces and places that one comes from and works in and lives in influences how you think about transformations to sustainability. So I live and work in South Africa, and so it's impossible to think about transformations to sustainability without thinking about social justice, about historical inequalities. Ultimately, though, transformations to sustainability needs to think about us all together on one planet and to think about both human well-being as well as planetary well-being.
It's a reconfiguration of the global economic system in a way in which, responsibility is fully incorporated in what we do economically and as consumers.
So transformation to sustainability means different things to different people. It has to be reflective of the heterogeneity of our condition globally, and also our diversities, our choices in terms of socio-cultural existences, and also the way in which we consume resources, the food we eat. The levels of complexity that humanity has to deal with day in and day out is unprecedented. And as a result, the question of sustainability becomes a very, very complex one. So we absolutely have to have complex responses to what inherently is a complex situation we are dealing with.
Why can't we be sustainable? I mean, there is a question about will and power. We see people who have power but not the will. And when you have power to make transformations but you're not willing to, then the transformation will not come and it will not happen.
Why are we not transforming? Given that it's been known for decades what the problems actually are, the Sustainable Development Goals are very clear about the kinds of problems that need to be addressed, but we're just not really making anything like the kind of progress that we should be. And the reason for that is that there are some very deeply entrenched, powerful structures of power and privilege that are stopping us getting there, that are stopping societies becoming more equal, that are stopping energy production becoming less polluting. And it is these interests that really need to be challenged. And that's a fundamentally political matter, not just a technical one.
We haven't as yet managed to deal with the economic imbalances that are producing the types of problems that we're sitting with. So we have a lot of ecologists, social scientists, that have been working very hard on the problem for a long time, but we don't have enough economists, and the finance sector has not come to the party in the same way. So I think until we can actually grapple with the economic inequalities and the way that the economic system functions, it's going to be very difficult to ultimately bring about the kinds of transformations that are necessary.
I mean, in part, we are locked in a global economic system that has hardly changed in 50 years, right? And there's a lot of vested interests, and there's a lot of subsidies and a lot of systems that keeps those systems going. The framing accepts environmental degradation, and inequality as part of an idea of economic development. And if we look through the world through those eyes, through those glasses, it's very hard to see solutions or to find, ways of dealing with. This is the framing that locks us. I think the complexity of the issues really, is mind blowing for most people.
I think when Americans, maybe people all over the wealthier parts of the world, think about techno-scientific solutions, what they're thinking about is that their ways of life will not be disordered, that they'll be able to consume just as much as they did yesterday, and tomorrow will be much the same as today. So no radical changes. And I think this is a commonality across societies. Societies, contrary to the ideology of disruptive innovation, I think societies don't really like being disordered. And again, through the COVID pandemic, we've been through an enormous natural experiment in this. People have their lives completely disrupted.
If you think of past progressive changes, women's emancipation, the end of colonization, at least in the form it took place in, the liberation of workers, the advent of the welfare state, these great progressive changes, transformations, if you like, of the past were not achieved by academics, scientists, governments of their own volition deciding that they would actually introduce a new policy. They were only achieved as a result of decades of political struggle, of democratic struggle by social movements and civil society. And it's really difficult to imagine why sustainability would be any different. And yet on so many key sustainability issues, like climate for instance, it's increasingly treated as if sustainability is a matter of do what the science says, of having evidence-based policies, and that we can be led by this kind of expert debate. And that's a problem. Expertise is absolutely crucial, but it's necessary and not sufficient. And just like the great transformations of the past, sustainability needs to be treated as a political matter for emancipatory movements.
I grew up in a society where we were subjected to massive social engineering. So for me, it's very problematic idea to think that we can engineer transformations to sustainability. And hence, I have a very strong commitment to learning and the importance of open processes of learning, collective learning, because people need to come to the story of transformation. They need to understand the reason why it's necessary. They need to be willing to join into the process. And that is an education and learning process. It can't be a social engineering process. And I think that a lot of the problems we have is because we're trying to too rapidly engineer transformation without giving people enough time to come to understand what it is that is happening around them and why it's important for them to also be part of the transformation from a perspective of understanding, being knowledgeable, and being willing to act. None of us know what the end point of sustainability is. So who decides needs to be everybody, and together we have to work it out. And we have to do that by learning and learning together, learning from each other, learning from different communities, learning from different contexts, learning from different cultures, learning from different languages, and learning from different societies, and then try to work it out together as we go forward.
One of the things that is keeping us where we are, and not despite the information we have to make a change, would be the gap in agency. And when I say agency here, I mean the capacity of people to be able to create change. Most of the changes that succeed over time are changes that are cultivated from I want to say from the bottom up. But these are changes that often lack agency and takes quite long to make that kind of disruption. So yes, we know what we're supposed to do, but the people who have the power to do it are less willing to be able to put it to action.
Another thing about sustainability is that it's not only is it not a single thing in any given time, it changes over time. Sustainability is not an end goal that we somehow achieved and then we're there. It's a process. It's a constant process of struggle and of redefining what the next direction should be. So I think we need to think in a much more open-ended, much more complex, much more dynamic way about sustainability. Embrace the uncertainties, embrace the pluralities, and see it much more as a process and not as a defined outcome that we have to settle in a given number of years.
we are we are at the risk of really crashing, and we are not even able to comprehend how serious the problem is. So research helps us to understand how complex and how huge and how dangerous the situation is already, and it has the capacity to provide intelligent pathways out of it.
Science is very important because science actually is what gives us information and details on how to do and how to practice sustainability. But what kind of science? That's also another question which is very important, because the kind of science that has been used so far, I think it has not been working that much. That's why we still have all these crises, I think. So when you talk of the science policy interface, you also have to bring the indigenous perspectives, and that should also sort of inform the policy. So science is important, but science that is formed with diverse of perspectives.
The big idea in transformation sustainability, I would say it's context. And context, because context allows us to have solutions that can be applied at the level that it's needed most. And context also allows us to be able to see the problems in the way that the people who are most affected sees it. And transformation, using, whether you're talking about technology, you're talking about policy, you're talking about research, needs to be contextual enough to be relevant to the people who need it most. And those are people who are at the lowest level of privilege most often, at the lowest level of development, and also at the lowest level of decision making. And in many ways, this would be the first step towards decolonizing how we think about transformation sustainability.
I feel that we have way too little understanding of the cultural dynamics of transformations. I think we have a lot of knowledge now of, the sort of more technical solutions like renewable energies and various of these kinds of things, but what we don't actually have enough knowledge of is how to transform our cultures. We really need all cultures to be engaged in the transformative processes, and we don't know enough about how to work with diversity of cultures in transformations to sustainability. And that takes us to issues of language, to issues of learning, to issues of socialization, to sociocultural practices. We're actually looking for the creativity of the world's cultures to join the transformations to sustainability movement in a much, much bigger way.
Well, when we think about the sheer scale of some of these problems of sustainability, it's easy to become paralyzed. What can we do? How can we in our everyday lives help us achieve these very daunting goals? And if we think that somehow that we have to persuade someone else, some very powerful interest in the global cockpit, to somehow achieve these aims, then it's understandable why we feel so paralyzed. But if instead it's much more like the flocking motion, if you look in birds or fish, the way they move in these great flocking motions, where when the time is right, the entire murmuration will move in a new direction. If that is the way in which profound social change occurs when the time is right, then it's not about trying to influence some distant remote center of power. It's about just doing the thing yourself, living what sustainability is, communicating horizontally to people around us, and not trying to communicate vertically up to these notional powerful actors who are going to decide in our interests. And so that sustainability then is about a billion tiny actions taking place throughout society in a billion different ways. They don't all have to be the same. They just need to be part of this murmurating politics that takes us together in ways we can't always see at all towards sustainability.